at work, home too. And you know, that has a broad reaching impact on friends and family, on your productivity, on your health. There, you know, all of these things can be captured to some extent quantifiably, but there, in my opinion, there's a significant amount of this that is really kind of on the soft side that's difficult to quantify in any way. But I think if you consider how other things affect you, and you know look to your own past experience, you can, I think, say pretty readily that conflict in the workplace has not only a significant impact at work, but it can impact you significantly at home as well. So there's a lot of good reasons, my point, finally, to deal with conflict. So where does it come from? How does it arise? So here are some common causes of conflict in the workplace and elsewhere. Miscommunication. So miscommunication can be something as simple as vague or imprecise language. That can be something like, get that to me as soon as possible. That obviously can be interpreted in many number of ways. My intent with that may be that I need it, you know, right away, as soon as you can get it to me. And someone else who's hearing that might say, well, I got this to do, I got that to do. You know, Friday afternoon is probably as soon as it's possible. So those can be two very separate definitions and ideas and interpretations of the same language. And that's just one example of any number of things where we're not taking the time to be precise in our language, to precisely lay out expectations to the folks that work for you, to lay out the basis for decision making. All of these things can feed conflict. Competition. You know, in certain circumstances, because I'm a conflict, you know, management mediator person, I like to think that there's a lot of avenues to win-win situations. But occasionally, you know, if two people are competing over the same singular promotion, there is a finite piece of pie, and that can promote conflict because somebody has to win and somebody has to lose in those circumstances. Finally, any number of differences. So, for instance, different priorities. My department, for instance, my experience in manufacturing, for instance, I worked in sales for a period of time, and I worked in manufacturing and in quality and a number of other places. But there was a significant divide between the outside sales force and manufacturing because they had different priorities. The outside sales force had direct relationships with their customers. They were there all the time. They saw the impact of any sort of delay from manufacturing or any sort of damage issues or quality issues immediately. And their priority was satisfying their customer so the customer would pay so they would get their commission. Manufacturing's priority was to meet their production goals, to reduce the amount of scrap, to reduce their amount of claims. So salesmen would file claims to get jobs done, and manufacturing would fight those claims because they would reflect poorly on their quality. Now, the problem wasn't that, you know, one was right or one was wrong, because there were probably times that both were wrong or both were right. But they had different priorities, and you encounter that all the time in the workplace. Depending on, you know, it's the old talk of like silos, you know, working in different departments. You know, you might have an overall vision, but a lot of times your specific priorities conflict with someone else's. That can lead to conflict. Values, your personal values, the values of a particular business, the customer's values versus your values. When it comes to values and principles, people, that is significant to people. So when there's something that contradicts those things, or they're asked to do something that contradicts those things, that can lead to conflict. Facts. We can see the same issue in two completely separate ways. And when we do that, we both feel the facts support our position, and that only buttresses our argument and makes us less inclined to accept whatever the other person is proposing. So often conflict can be born out of a different view of the same fact. Approaches. Some people, this can be approaches as far as style of management, communication style. It could be any number of things. Certain people like to manage from an urgency standpoint, right? Like everything is a crisis. We need to get things going. Other people want to do things very methodically and slow and make sure everything is done. When those two people have to work on the same project or depend on each other for something or try to meet deadlines together, that can lead to all sorts of conflict because they have inherently different approaches to the same issue. So those are some examples of causes of conflict. All right. So this is a fun little exercise. So if you look at the screen, you'll see a picture. So I want you to spend a second thinking about what you see. In most cases, people are probably identifying a lady. And then the question is, what is the lady? What is the lady's head position? What does she look like? I'll give you a chance to look at it and think about that. So what we're looking at here is, in fact, a picture of two ladies. There's one lady, and I don't know if you can even see here my little pointer, but I'll talk while I do it. So there's one lady where her nose is extending out from her cheek, and there's one eyelash you can see, and it looks like she's looking away from the picture, with her chin just touching the black maybe fur on like a scarf or something. And then there's another lady who that chin that touches the black part is actually her nose. And if you look further down, you will see an opening of the extension of the black from her hair that cuts across. That is her mouth, and then the completion of the white there would be her chin. So what I'm showing you here, apart from a clever drawing, is a representation of how we see things in the world. And one of the things that affects how we deal with everything is our worldview. Some people may have seen the lady looking away first. Some people may have seen what appears to be maybe an older woman looking more to the left of your to the left of your screen. Some people can only see one of them. Some people can see both fairly readily. But the point is, we all look at things differently, and what colors that is our worldview and our experience, our age, what region of the world we came from, our race, our sexual orientation, our life experience, cultural background. Any number of things can impact how we view things. So from something like a simple picture to this, to a heated conversation in a boardroom and everything in between, everything that we do is colored by that filter, how we view the world. So when we're dealing with conflict, we have to be conscious of the fact that everyone is looking through it, and everyone's worldview is slightly different than the next person's. Nobody really shares your precise worldview. So if you'll see, these are some of the things I laid out that are critical impacts to how we view the world. There are a number of others. Okay, so what that leads me to is we can see the same thing differently. We can say that we can see the same set of circumstances differently. And there's an inclination of people when they're in the throes of a dispute or conflict to think, if I could just convince them to look at it my way, we could settle this. if they would just see it my way. And sometimes that's impossible. Sometimes you can convince a person of your perspective, but there's many times, and certainly as a mediator I've experienced it, I can't tell you how many times, where two people are going to see the same exact incident, the same exact set of facts or circumstances in two different ways, and that's not going to change. So the question is, does that mean that there's no way to settle that? No. There's a common phrase, at least within my circle of mediators, that we don't need to agree to reach an agreement. The fact that we see the circumstances differently is perfectly fine. Let's acknowledge that and move on from that and try to resolve it in a way that works for both of us going forward. So, conflict styles. So this is a rather often used graph by two gentlemen. I think his name's Harry Thomas, and I don't know the other gentleman's name, but Kilman. The Thomas Kilman conflict mode instrument. And what it demonstrates is kind of the 5 different categories of style for conflict. So you'll see it's done on a graph where going up from the left corner is an assertiveness scale. So as it goes up, it's more and more assertive. And then if you go from the left to the right, it goes from uncooperative to more cooperative. All right? So these are all kind of graphed according to their assertiveness and cooperativeness. So I'm going to start I'm going to talk a little bit about each of them, but before I do that, I want to say generally, we all have default conflict style. We have an area maybe where we're most comfortable. You know, maybe we tend to avoid conflict at all costs. Maybe we're very competitive and we're kind of a win at all costs person. And that's fine. And we all approach conflict a little differently. The point of this is, it's not all defining. We might have an area where we tend to, but I think all of us can come up with examples of times where we've kind of drifted out of that and operated in different areas because the circumstances seemed to call for it, or we were propelled there by something. So what we're going to talk about is what each of these styles means, when they're appropriate, and how to use them effectively, and maybe when they're not so appropriate. They're kind of their positives and drawbacks. So we're going to start with competing. Competing is high assertive, very aggressive, not shy, happy to offer opinions and win at all costs. It is low cooperative. It prioritizes winning over relationships. So that can be viewed, any number of ways. There are times when a competing style of conflict is not only appropriate but necessary. If you have a toddler and they run towards the street where they're going to run into traffic, you are not going to adopt a collaborative style with your toddler. You're not going to try to engage them in a prolonged negotiation about the benefits and drawbacks to walking into traffic as a 3-year-old. What you're going to do is you're going to go grab the child and pull them away and keep them out from walking out in front of traffic, right? That is a competing style. You're not concerned about the relationship. You're about winning, and in this case, protecting the child, and that trumps all of the other stuff. So that's perfectly appropriate. Where it might not be as appropriate is where you have a relationship you want to preserve, and winning at all costs in the short term may be appealing, but in the long term may cause you more woe. And an old example of that is two neighbors have an adjoining fence, and a tree, the one neighbor's tree falls on the other neighbor's fence. So winning to the neighbor with the fence might be compelling the other neighbor to pay for the fence and additional costs and all sorts of other pain and woe, and suing them and winning in court. That may be appropriate in certain circumstances, but if you plan on having to live next door to that neighbor for an ongoing basis, and that relationship to some degree is important to you, not necessarily that you're going to be best friends, but that you have to consistently interact with them, maybe a win at all costs approach to that is not necessarily appropriate, right? That you need to, at some level, consider the relationship as part of the priority. So that's competing. Next, avoiding. So avoiding is low assertive and low cooperative. So this is a person who is not engaging at all. They're not interested in offering their opinion. They're just kind of recoiling from conflict altogether. The result of that is they're not likely to get what they want very often, unless by chance, right? But they're also, presumably doing it to protect themselves from harm, whether real or imagined. So in some cases, avoiding may be perfectly appropriate. When you do not have a stake in the matter, the avoiding style is perfectly appropriate, right? Two of your coworkers are arguing over whether the Bears should cut Jay Cutler. You don't like football. Both of their relationship is important to you. They're trying to drag you into that argument. You don't care about Jay Cutler. You don't want to participate in that. I'm not interested in football, and I'm not interested in alienating one of you, right? So you don't participate in that argument. That's a fairly simple kind of low harm issue, but there can be, you could be avoiding actual physical danger, that you encountered a knife fight and you don't feel equipped to step between. You might adopt an avoiding conflict style, right? Because you are not equipped to stop them and you're not going to cause yourself harm in the meanwhile. So that's where that can be effective. Where it can cause problems, obviously, is in the workplace. If you are constantly avoiding, you're never going to get what you want, or you're very unlikely to get what you want. And two, your coworkers are not going to view you as an active participant or an active partner in any significant issue if they don't feel like you're going to in any way participate when things get a little heavy. So that can be a drawback. Again, there's good and bad to each of these. Okay, so compromising smack dab in the middle of the graph, and that's because it kind of fits right in the middle, right? When you're compromising, you're splitting it down the middle. You're not necessarily giving everything up, but you're giving a little to get a little, right? You want 25 or you want $100, I want to give you 25, we settle at 50, right? I think I said that, right? Did I say 75 and 25? My math meant 25 and 75. Anyway, so compromising is good from a time standpoint. You don't use up a lot of time. You can get to a solution quickly, but oftentimes everyone leaves with a little bit unhappy. There's an old saying about a good solution is when everybody walks away from the table unhappy. I don't happen to share that opinion, but I would say that is a product of a compromising style. You get a little of what you want, but you never get all of it. So over time that can build resentment. I'm always compromising. I never get just what I want, right? So that's the downside to it. The upside is not everything requires a long, drawn-out negotiation. Sometimes you just want to compromise to move on and move on to more significant action. So that's compromising. Accommodating. Low assertive, but high cooperative. So in accommodating, you're prioritizing relationships over your needs and interests. So you're always giving in. You are it's more important to you to preserve the relationship than it is to get what you want. So in the short term, it doesn't create conflict necessarily, or it quells conflict because the other person has gotten what they want. But in the long term, it probably fosters some resentment. If you're always accommodating, you find yourself in a position either where you're regularly being taken advantage of, or you feel like you are, or you feel like you're always, you're always giving in. So that can be problematic. It can be very appropriate too. Early on, like in a work relationship, you might be more inclined to be accommodating until you kind of understand what different people's styles are and how they work together. You might be more accommodating because of a leverage situation, right? So you don't really have a choice maybe. If you are receiving direct orders from your boss, manager, supervisor, the board of directors, to some extent you have to accommodate certain things. There's the saying, pick your battle. So in some cases you need to be accommodating. But again, what accommodating does is it prioritizes the relationship over everything else. And finally, collaborating. So collaborating is high assertive and high cooperative. So collaborating is the most difficult and the most time-consuming of all these things, because you've got all the participants operating on a high assertive level and a high cooperative level. The welcoming participation from everybody, but everyone is actively expressing opinions and coming up with ideas as to how to resolve it, and aggressively making their case for that. This is where innovation is born. This is tough, long work where you're trying to find win-win situations. Collaborating, while I just talked it up in a very positive way, is not always appropriate either. If you've got 100 people and you've got 5 minutes to figure out where you're going to order lunch from, if you're going to try to collaborate on that, you're going to not be getting lunch probably till the next day. Because to find everybody asserting their interests for something like that, it's unlikely that that's going to get resolved very quickly, right? So collaborating is appropriate when you have significant issues that need to be resolved with the appropriate time available to do so, right? So when you collaborate, you have the opportunity to innovate, to make big changes, and to have significant buy-in from everybody participating. But it also takes a lot of time, and it's risky. Everyone is sticking their neck out with ideas and opinions, and not everyone is always comfortable with that. So those are our conflict styles. Just as a wrap-up, these are all good, appropriate styles at different times. And what you want to think about, leaving here, is where do I usually operate? And when does it serve me well? And maybe when hasn't it served me well? And maybe when should I have considered maybe adopting a different approach? We're all creatures of habit, and we tend to deal with things, even not necessarily always consciously, in ways that we've kind of created those trenches for in the past. So, if you're highly competitive, you're that's your go-to. You might want to, rethink that in certain circumstances. All right. So that gets us to interest-based bargaining. Interest-based bargaining, it's a negotiating strategy in which both sides are working. Oops, how did I do that? With their common interests and balancing opposing interests in lieu of arguing opposing positions. Okay, so broadly, instead of arguing over positions, we're arguing over the underlying needs and interests below those positions. Instead of arguing about the $5,000, why is it that I need, what does that $5,000 represent for me? So when we're talking, going forward, when we're talking about skills and strategies, they're all being done kind of under the umbrella of what is, broadly known as interest-based bargaining, which goes back to like the classic book Getting to Yes by Fisher and Urey, which is just it's a really good book about a lot of this stuff. But really, what we're talking about here is needs and interests are the goal that you're seeking when you're negotiating and trying to resolve issues, not positions, not like superficial level, like proposals. What are the underlying needs and interests, and how do I address them? So, as an example, we're going to talk about the Battle of the Orange. So I'm going to tell a quick story, and then we'll go from there. So you have two roommates. You have Earl and Steve. Earl works a 10-hour day. It's a terrible day. He's exhausted. It's his 6th day of work in a row. He's on the bus coming home, and all he can think about is the orange in the fridge. There's an orange in the fridge that he's really looking forward to, and after the day he's had, it would just be nice. He's kind of visualizing that. Okay, once I get home, get the orange, everything will be cool. Steve's had a lousy day too. He had classes all day, 2 tests he did terrible on. He's really disappointed. He's exhausted. He's got to work a double later, and he's riding his bike home, and all he can think about is that orange in the fridge. Maybe I'll have the orange. Once I get the orange, things will, I'll be able to settle down. Things will be cool. So they both get home. They both encounter the orange, the fridge at the same time. They converge on the fridge at the same time, and both want the orange. So herein lies the conflict, right? Who gets the orange? So we do this. This is an old story. I think it's been used in training for years and years and years. But when we're doing this in a public setting, the question then is posed to the group, and I'm posing it to you, whoever happens to be listening to me right now. How do you resolve that? Who gets the orange? Typical answers: cut it in half. Whoever bought the orange gets the orange. They flip a coin. One person gets the orange, the other person gets it. Another example might be one person, I get the orange this time, you get it next time. So those are all fairly standard answers. So the common thread between all those answers are what? These are all kind of compromise answers, right? Everybody loses. Or one person wins, one person loses. It's split in half. Nobody gets the orange. It's the old parent one. If you kids can't agree, then nobody gets it type of thing. So there's always a loser with all of your standard responses. Because we're talking about the orange, right? All of the discussion and orientation has been around who gets the orange. Instead, when we're talking about interest-based bargaining, we're talking about why do they want the orange. So when you're in conflict, you need to understand the underlying needs and interests. So in this case, Earl wanted the orange because he wanted to get the zest from it and make his chocolate orange zest muffin that is like therapy for him, right? And Steve just wanted a tall glass of orange juice. Both of them could get that from the orange. What you find when you look below the position, when you look below the orange into what the orange represents, when you're dealing in conflict, is you open up all sorts of new opportunities. Not everything can be resolved as cleanly and magically as this little orange demonstration. But as like another example, if myself and my coworker are arguing over whether the door in the office should be open or closed, if all we talk about is the door and its status as either open or closed, there aren't too many remedies, right? It's either going to be open or closed or halfway open. And in each case, like the orange, one of us loses or none of us wins, right? But if we, instead of talking about the door itself, we talk about the underlying needs and interests below the door, maybe I want it shut because I have security concerns. Maybe I want it open because I need to make a quick break. Maybe I want it shut because it's cold outside or it's windy or it's noisy. Maybe I want it open because I need to have some fresh air in here or it's too hot in here. So now we've exposed all these potential needs and interests that underlie it, and now we can try to generate options and solutions around this broad spectrum of potential solutions instead of just door open, door closed. Who gets the orange? Cut it in half. One gets it, one doesn't. So the theme behind all this is, instead of talking about the orange or the door or the $5,000 or whatever the superficial level or superficial issue is, you want to move beyond that and understand the other person's needs and interests, because that's where the real opportunities for resolution and cooperation and everything else exist. So here's a cute little picture. This goes to that. So in this picture, you see a bird singing, and then you see a guy whistling at it, and then you see the bird says, "I don't need your blank and help. I just need you to listen." So sometimes people just want you to listen. And that enters very easily into what we're talking about here with conflict. You want to hear first and express later. If you try to problem solve too early, or if you go into exactly what all the issues are, instead of listening, you can create problems. If you try to problem solve the orange thing without knowing what the needs and interests are, you're not going to solve it, right? So the idea here is listening is critical to this whole process. And it's a fun little cartoon. So this gets us finally to some skills and strategies. Active listening, effective questions, summarization, and emotions. All of these are tools to getting to those needs and interests that are so critical. And they're done in this order for a fairly good reason. Active listening. So I'm sure most of you in some way, shape, or form at some seminar or, on TV or a webinar like this or something have heard the phrase active listening and or have studied. What we're talking about is body language. These are all things when you're involved, whether it's conflict or not, but if someone is speaking to you, these are things you want to be conscious of. You want to demonstrate with your body language that you are engaged with them. You shouldn't be looking at your phone. You should be looking at them. You should be relatively still. You should not be rolling your eyes or other issues like that. You want to be engaged in a way that reassures them that you're there listening to them. 2, minimal interruptions. Let them speak. Don't even feel like you need to do a lot of kind of the verbal cues like, yeah, right, okay. Try to even minimize that, because that can be disruptive when somebody's trying, especially when they're, at all emotional or something. Just slight head nods and other like kind of nonverbal cues are plenty to demonstrate to a person that you're listening to them. And certainly like larger interruptions to either correct them or something along those lines can wait. Even most clarifications can wait until like an appropriate time. No judgment. So if a person's telling you a story and you're like, oh, well, you never should have done that. That's not going to, from a conflict standpoint, that is not helpful. You're there at this point to hear what happened to them and to acknowledge it. If you're in particular, if it's a dispute between you and that person, any sort of judgment like that is likely to put the other person on the defensive. And when we're on the defensive, we are not productive. We do not have productive conversations. We do not offer up real opinions and issues. We are trying to defend against whatever perceived judgment exists on the other side. So it's not effective or helpful when we're listening. Be present. So this is a little bit kind of, Buddhist, Zen type of feel, but be in the moment with the person. Don't worry about what your 4 different responses you need to conjure up to deal with this once they're done talking. Stay in the moment and listen to what they're saying. Don't leave it. Stay there with them and hear them. That's absolutely critical, because they, you know, your job is to hear and listen for what's important to them. If you're not doing that, you're going to miss what's critical, and or it's going to be obvious to them, and they're not going to think that you're really dealing with them in good faith. So once you're done listening and you're having a conversation, you need to ask effective questions. Broadly, two types of questions: closed-ended and open-ended. Closed-ended questions are yes/no questions, seeking specific information. How tall are you? What color was the wall? You know, how fast were you going? Those sorts of things. In closed-ended questions, the asker is in control of the conversation. You know, they can be perceived almost as like interrogating the person if there's a number of closed-ended questions one after another. It can lead to kind of a choppy, awkward conversation if there's just closed-ended question after closed-ended question. But it can also get you very specific information, right? Closed-ended questions are appropriate when you are trying to clarify something, and or when you're trying to corral someone who might be rambling on and going on too long, where you want to focus the conversation. You might bring them back with a very, you know, precisely worded closed-ended question. Open-ended questions are unbounded. The askee is in control. You ask them an open-ended question like, you know, tell me what it's like to work for the Chamber of Commerce. Now that askee can take that a million different ways. The person answering that question can answer that in any number of ways at whatever length they choose. They're going to give you lots of information. The benefit is they're going to, in many cases, that is going to be a guide to, you know, what's really important to them, because they're controlling it. They're going to talk about it. They don't feel bound by a closed-ended question. Closed-ended questions can be very restraining. You know, I'd love to elaborate, but all he asked me was, whether this was this or this was that. And I'd like to explain because it's a little grayer than that, but I can't because it's just this. So when you're asking open-ended questions, you give them that freedom to take it where they feel it's important. You have to understand, of course, that that does mean that you are feeding some control in the conversation. And it builds rapport. The conversation flows better. People, you know, like having control of the conversation when they're answering questions. They're, you know, in many cases talking about what's important to them. So that, in most cases, makes people happy. So that's the benefit. Both can be used effectively when dealing with conflict. The benefits to closed-ended questions, like I said, are if you do need to clarify or if you need to corral conversations. The benefits to open-ended questions are in most cases, they're the types of questions that are going to get you to what is really at heart of the, you know, whatever issue is at hand. Summarization. So this is, when I talk about this in mediation, when I'm training mediators, I call this the unnatural act of mediation. So in this case, people, you know, after a person has maybe gone on a long rant, you summarize briefly. So what I heard you say was blah, 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 blah. This demonstrates understanding. It lets them know they've been, you know, heard. If you get something wrong, they can correct and clarify and even hone your understanding more. It can be used too often and maybe seem awkward, but it can be really effective in demonstrating to the other person that you're engaged with what they're saying, you're taking them seriously, and it can highlight key issues. And I'm hurrying now because I just realized I'm running a little late. We did get a late start, but I'm not sure how all that works. Okay, emotions. Emotions are gold mines for needs and interests. They're typically a symptom of unmet needs and interests. When a person is emotional, the inclination, especially in the workplace, is to get as far away from it as possible. In most cases, people are not comfortable dealing with it. They are, in many ways, barriers to resolution because it's difficult to talk to a person that is maybe in a highly emotional state. But what I'm saying here is, you know, with some simple techniques, you can de-escalate things and deal directly with emotions in a way that allows you to understand what the underlying unmet needs and interests are that are spurring on those emotions. When people are in a highly emotional state, their judgment isn't always the best. It's a lot more difficult for them to analyze options and make good choices. So you don't want people at a high emotional state for any period of time. But when you recognize that someone's in an emotional state, as the other person, there's ways to first to ID it, second to acknowledge it. And this can be difficult because this isn't always the most comfortable conversation. But you can say, and it's important that you own it as, like with sensory terms. I hear that when this topic comes up, it makes you angry. Instead of, why are you always so angry? Okay, so if you say, why are you always so angry, the other person's going to be put on the defensive, and you are not going to get anywhere in trying to understand what the underlying causes are for that. In many cases, there might be occasionally where they'll blurt it out. But if you deal with it productively and acknowledge that there's anger there, but give them some space to talk about it, then you can follow up and explore it. What is it about such and such that makes you so angry? What is it about this that, you know, when this sort, you know, I noticed when such and such was speaking, you got very quiet. You know, what is it about that that makes you feel that way? Can you talk to me a little bit about that? Those are huge avenues to unmet needs and interests. And like I've said from the beginning, unmet needs and identifying needs and interests and working with them are the keys to options generation. So we've gone through this whole process, right? We've unearthed these needs and interests on the other person. Now, from the other person, now we've got to figure out how to get a resolution out of it. So now, instead of problem solving at the front end, which is often case that's our inclination, because we want to get it done. We have limited time. We just need to solve this. But if we don't do all that other front end work, we're not going to get to the real needs and interests, and we're going to be cutting an orange in half instead of giving one person the rind and the other person the juice, right? So when you're generating options, you should only be trying to problem solve when all this is done, when all this other work has been done. Because now you have these needs and interests, and both sides, you and the other person, recognize what your and the other person's interests are, and you can try to craft solutions around those needs and interests. And that's when you get true collaborative resolution. So quick overview. Do's and don'ts. When you're in a dispute, conflict situation, look forward. Don't dwell in the past. Make everything forward thinking. What are we going to do to make this better in the future? Listen. Actively listen, like we talked about. Invite collaboration. Create an atmosphere where people feel safe and comfortable aggressively asserting their opinion, and you doing the same. Both and. It doesn't have to be I win, you lose. Or it doesn't have to be I'm right, you're wrong. It can be both this and that. If you acknowledge that, it goes back to we don't have to agree to reach an agreement. And focus on needs and interests, not positions. Don't. Ultimatums. Some of this is obvious, but you see it regularly. Ultimatums and threats are going to put whoever you're dealing with on the defensive. It's going to completely change the tone of the conversation, and they're not going to be productive. Focusing on where blame lies versus how to fix it is highly unproductive as well. Inflammatory language. Don't escalate it. If anything, you want to bring it back down. That, of course, does not mean running from emotions. Like we just demonstrated, you can deal with emotions in a way that can be productive without inflaming the situation. And finally, judge. Don't judge. Don't, judgment. Judgment there's lots of appropriate uses for it, but in the throes of conflict, judgment is not helpful. Judging the other person's actions or character or anything like that is only going to, again, put them in a adversarial defensive mode where you're not going to be able to create real resolutions. And as a summary, so the process goes from self-awareness. Where am I at? What are my needs and interests? How am I going to approach this? What kind of conflict style am I comfortable in? And what is the situation calling for? I want to create an open, non-judgmental atmosphere. I want to actively listen. I want to follow that up with effective questions. I want to do emotions work. I want to focus on important items. And then all of that work will, in most cases, unearth needs and interests. Once I see those needs and interests, I tie all of my problem solving, and not before that, to those needs and interests. So I think I've got it all in there, and I think we just hit 3 o'clock. I don't know if there's still time for questions and answers. If anybody has any, I'm happy to answer any. I'll wait a sec and just see if anything pops up. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for hearing me out on all this and for attending this. This was the 3rd and last series of the Wednesday webinar series for February. The next series will be Tech and Cybersecurity, and we'll start on Wednesday, May 11th. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of your week. See ya.